welcome to our continuous coverage on the GST Constitutional Amendment Bill. As the Rajya Sabha debates this landmark legislation, CNBC TV 18 is your one-stop destination to get the most comprehensive coverage as we wait for the upper house of parliament to pass the bill paving the way for India to have one tax throughout the nation. Joining us now are some of the biggest voices from India Inc. and the state ministers who matter. Let's go over to Shireen Bhan, who has with her the Karnataka Industries Minister R.V. Deshpande and Pawan Goenka of Phenomen. Shireen, over to you.
Well, thanks very much. I also have with me BMR advisors Rajeev Dimri. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here. Mr. Deshpande, let me start by asking you, because political parties have made their pitch in Parliament on what the rate should be and, of course, on the basis of equity, what the principle should be in terms of apportioning money between the centre and the states. As far as the rate itself is concerned, Mr. Deshpande, the former finance minister making a very clear pitch that the standard rate should be 18%, but most other state finance ministers don't seem to agree with that. Your first reaction?
Please understand, the economic advisor, Mr. Arvind Subramanian, also has recommended that rate. And I think it is reasonable that 18% should be the rate. Please understand, this is a very important reform which the government has brought, and ultimately you should also know that though it was delayed, in a way it was good, because a lot of concerns expressed by the Congress party have been met by the NDA government by agreeing to so many good suggestions. So ultimately we are interested in the nation. So this legislation has made one nation, one rate. And I'm sure it is going to boost the economy of the country and more so of the states.
Well, if I can ask you to give us some sectoral impacts, sir, because I'm sure that as industry minister, you've had a lot of representations from industry based in the state of Karnataka, largely the e-commerce business, a lot of those startups there. And there have been concerns on what this will eventually mean as far as the e-commerce sector. What have those representations to you been about? What are the contentious issues that have been raised? And do you believe that, the implications will not be negative?
See, please understand, ultimately the governments, state governments and government of India will have to also ponder over all these issues. It is e-commerce or any other industry, ultimately this legislation should not be harmful. And I'm sure the tax rates which are being discussed now are not going to remain permanently. In future the tax rates could be also lower. So that is also to be kept in mind.
We don't know what the tax rate will be. That hasn't been decided just yet. But let me also bring in Pawan Goenka. Mr. Goenka, appreciate you joining us. I don't know if you've been watching the debates in Parliament, sir, but the highlight for you, if you have been?
I'm sorry, can you say the last sentence again?
I said, I don't know if you've been watching the debate in Parliament, but yeah, any highlight?
No, unfortunately, I had to do work during the day, so I couldn't watch the debate. But from what I understand, there is a general alignment that's happening, except for one state that seems to be against it. There's a debate on what the rates should be. But it appears to me, from what I have seen, that the bill will be passed hopefully tomorrow, and then we should get on our way to implement GST.
Well, actually, the government is hoping to pass the bill tonight itself, Mr. Goenka. We anticipate that the vote should be at about 8 p.m. or between 8 to 9 p.m. So we could see the bill being passed today itself. But, let me ask you about what the implications will be as far as industry is concerned, because a lot of the contentious issues, the fine print continues to be a work in progress. Now, the model GST law is a complex document. It's a complicated document. And there hasn't been enough stakeholder feedback so far, is what we're given to understand from government. So as far as the nitty-gritties now, what is it that industry would want clarification or clarity on going forward?
Well, let me just sort of put it in 2-3 buckets. The first bucket is a transition. how we transit from the current indirect tax regime to GST. And for many industries, specifically auto industry, the transition is going to be fairly complex because of our very long lead time from when something gets started in manufacturing to when it gets sold to the end consumer, and a lot of things in between. So we have to plan out the transition very carefully so that the industry does not end up in a sort of confusion during the period from, let's say, January, February to May or June. So that's a very important issue for us. The second issue is complexity of documentation. And right now, as we look at the model GST law that has been put down, there's still a lot of things that we need to fine-tune, that we need to work on. We shouldn't end up in a situation where GST by itself becomes a very complex requirement of compliance, documentation, and so on. So the government has to look at very carefully and talk to industry, understand from the stakeholders what all we are concerned about in terms of documentation. The third area of concern is that certain things...
I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir. I'll come back to that. But any specific concerns that you would like addressed? And specifically from the auto sector's perspective, you said it's going to be complex, the GST compliance. How prepared and how ready is industry at this point in time? What are your conversations at SIAM, for instance, telling you about the preparedness to switch over to the GST?
The way we look at this right now, there is no fundamental concerns in terms of documentation and compliance, but there's a lot of fine print that we need to work with the government and ensure that everything aligns together. So my guess is that once the bill is passed, everybody is going to become more serious, both the industry side and those who are responsible for implementing it, and a lot of things will happen. Even though there are concerns raised on do we have enough time to get ready by April 1st, I do believe that from August to April, which is about 8 months, that's a lot of time to fix things. After all, it's not something that's just coming. Everybody has been waiting for it. Industry has thought out, planned out, started doing some work. So I'm not going to be too concerned about that. What I said is that all of these things have to be taken care of. Since there is state level tax, there is a central level tax, there is a integrated tax, different regulations, requirements may be there. So I don't even know all the fine points right now myself, fine print. But something that people have said that we just need to work with the implementing authorities and ensure that our voices are heard, and the government is very careful about ensuring that the GST compliance does not become too complex. Fundamentally, we don't see a problem. We just need to make sure that the I's are dotted and T's are crossed properly. The third point I just want to make out, which is, third point is about various incentives that have been tied to either VAT or excise duty in the past. The state incentives for investments that we have made in our plants. How will that transition in the GST? Because this is not a small amount of money, and a lot of business plans have been made on that basis. So that transition also has to be looked at on how do we go from VAT regime to state GST or a central GST regime, and how do we ensure that industry does not lose out in the process of moving from VAT excise duty to GST regime. So these are the three sort of main concerns that we have. Otherwise, there are hundreds of positives that we're looking forward to, but just these three areas of concern.
Now, I'm glad that you're raising the concerns, and we'll try and get some of them answered as best as we possibly can. But Mr. Goenka, very quickly, I also wanted to talk to you about the conversations that you're, for instance, having with your suppliers on the GST as well, because this is going to be again a complicated and a complex transition for them as well.
I frankly do not consider that it's going to be any more complex than what it is today. In fact, it will be simplified, because today there are, I'm told, 17 different indirect taxes that one has to deal with. That will go to one indirect tax. So that has to simplify things. It won't complicate. Yes, it's a transition. We have to relearn something, or not relearn, but you have to learn something new. But that is a very short duration where we have to go through this learning process. I think suppliers will be very happy, OEMs will be very happy with transition to GST. Our documentation, end of the day, will become simpler, transactions will become simpler, keeping track of input GST, output GST, all of that will become much simpler. So I don't see that as a concern at all.
Okay, let me bring in Rajeev Dimri, now the tax expert on our panel. Rajeev, appreciate you joining us here. Very quickly, I want you to comment on some of the concerns that were raised there by Dr. Pawan Goenka, and these are concerns that industry across the board, not just the auto sector, but across the board, is faced with today. Any clarity, any clarifications that you'd like to offer?
Well, I mean, the points that Mr. Goenka raised are fine print that needs to be seen, the nitty-gritty that needs to be seen. What you're hearing from the manufacturing sector is, in some form or shape, things that will be a short-term, perhaps transition issues, but the long-term, there should not be any difficulties. And that's the manufacturing, trading, goods companies' issues. The spectrum changes completely for service companies because they have to not just unlearn few things, they have to learn completely new things. For instance, where does state boundary begin and end? So yes, of course, what we have is the first draft. People are biting their teeth into it, but everybody understands that these are first draft. We need to understand the rate policy. We need to understand all the compliance issues for that. And a lot of representations and engagement with the stakeholder is yet to begin in the right manner, and hopefully that will happen pretty quickly, as was also the comment that maybe the industry will also put in a lot more energy after, hopefully today when the Constitutional Amendment Bill is passed, the seriousness will dawn and everybody will start paying a lot more attention to it. So a lot of things will have to be done in a relatively short period of time. For some, the transition at the end of the day will bring out more efficiencies and perhaps reduction of cost. At the same time, there are other segment of commerce, which is, let's say, largely the service companies, that will find a completely different environment at the other end of this process.
Let me, talk to you about the rate, Rajeev, because, we had the Kerala Finance Minister saying that most state finance ministers didn't agree with the recommendation of the Arvind Subramaniam panel, where the revenue neutral rate has been recommended at 15 to 15.5% and the standard rate at 18%. We also just had Mr. Govinda Rao of the NIPFP, and NIPFP has suggested a bunch of rates, but saying that, the government must just take a political risk and announce a rate of 20%, and perhaps 22% would be most appropriate. The former finance minister in Parliament saying that look at the global average, it's much lower than 18%, which Mr. Govinda Rao says is not true. Norway is the only exception, otherwise the single rate is significantly higher across the European Union. But what would be an appropriate rate that balances out concerns?
Well, yes, I heard the statement that was made that the global average is 14, 15, 16%. The larger data that I have is that an average rate across Europe, which in a sense is a representative for GST, is about 19%, the Scandinavian countries being much higher. So that's one part. I don't think 14, 15 is certainly the global average of large economies. The other part, that if a state today is saying, let's assume that 18% they're objecting to, their share out of that 18 would be the 9 or 10. Any state that is making a comment that this is not enough, somewhere is also making a assessment of what is the total economic size of services in that particular state, because only when you compare 9% of goods and 9% of services and then look at what is the total money that the state is likely to earn, I am not sure how many states will have an exact data of the total services they will have access to in terms of taxes. I'm sure that at an economy level that information exists. So if the Chief Economic Advisor's assumptions are incorrect about the size of the service industry, if the conversation is beginning from people not accepting that, I buy the argument that any comment, whether the rate should be 22% or 16%, whichever way the comments are, the big assumption is that while the goods rates will come down at the state level, average of 12, 12.5%, 13%, to let's say 9, 10, whatever is their share of the rate, the big piece is what will happen to the service in a state. Now, there are states with a lot more share of the services, and there are states that will have very little share of the services, and that I do accept that no one particular rate can cut across all states. But any state that is asking for a rate different must have that data available, and I haven't seen too much comments about that.
Yes, you're absolutely right. But very quickly, you said that 19% would be the average for large economies for the GST rate?
If you compare the Europe as a trading bloc and as a representative sample or a very large sample for GST, the average rate across Europe is 19%.
Is 19%. Mr. Goenka, let me come back to you then. And of course, industry does believe that 18% is the most appropriate rate. They're also okay to live with 20%, but anything higher than 20% industry believes will be very uncomfortable. Where do you stand as far as rates are concerned, and how do you see this playing out?
Well, I have made a comment that anything between 18 and 20 is fine, but I would also like to add that I really am not an expert in deciding what the right rate should be. Clearly, there are 2 or 3 considerations that have to go in. The revenues cannot be compromised. I mean, that we have to keep in mind, that the government revenue cannot be compromised, and therefore the rate has to be slightly higher than what is calculated as the revenue neutral rate. That is one. Second is one has to look at the inflation impact that it might have, which I think will be short term no matter what the rate is. And third is, does it have sort of an effect on common man in terms of what it does to the purchasing power of a common man, whether it's goods or services. Considering all of that, I think we are arguing 18 plus minus, probably not minus, but 18 to 18 and 20. This is what we are arguing. What my bigger concern is not whether it's 18 or 20. My bigger concern is that there should not be too many exceptions made to the standard rate, either up or down. And it's very important that we don't get into again the same situation of various interest groups lobbying for their goods or service being outside the standard rate and being lower, or some NGOs lobbying that certain things should be higher. That would again distort the whole picture. So I would urge the government of India to try and maintain as many things as possible on the standard rate, whether it's 18 or 20. I don't really mind so much, but it's more to make sure that there are not too many exceptions. And the exception rate should not also be too far from 18-20. It may be plus minus 8.
Okay. Okay, let me go back across to the Industry Minister of Karnataka, Mr. Deshpande. Mr. Deshpande, just talking about the exclusions now, and today we saw the AIADMK moving amendments to the Constitutional Amendment Bill, saying very clearly that alcohol and petroleum both must be left out. Alcohol, the Finance Minister agreeing that will be left out of the GST ambit because most states agree to that. But he did say that petroleum hopefully will be brought under the ambit of the GST once the GST Council's approval comes in. Where does your government stand on both the inclusion of alcohol as well as petroleum products?
We have not agreed for alcohol and petroleum to be brought under the GST, because please understand, in the process the government's revenue are also important. Every state is a welfare state, we have also obligations, and ultimately at no cost the state governments can compromise their existing revenues. No doubt the Government of India has said that in the legislation they will provide compensation for the next 5 years, but still then ultimately revenues cannot be compromised, and this petroleum and the alcohol are revenues which are very important for a state. It will be difficult for compromise on those issues. But understand, the GST is really a great reform which can boost the entire economy of the country, and also can add about 1% to 2% more to the GDP of the country. So ultimately we are here to welcome the legislation.
That's good to hear, sir, and the Congress party also extending its support to the GST bill in Parliament. But let me ask you if there's been any assessment or calculation that's been done by your government in terms of the revenue loss, if at all, because for instance, Tamil Nadu, of course, it's a manufacturing state, has said that they stand to lose a little over 9,000 crore rupees annually. Have you done any GST related maths, sir, within your government?
Yes, as far as the manufacturing, yes, we will lose something, but ultimately Karnataka is also a state which consumes a lot, you see. Service industry is there, and then ultimately will be compensated, but ultimately in the interest, national interest, we have to also somewhere compromise, and we have welcomed this legislation and supported the legislation.
Yes. Now the negotiations will start, Mr. Deshpande, on the actual GST bill, which we believe will be brought to Parliament during the winter session. And of course, all political parties have very categorically stated that it's a bill that should be brought not as a money bill, but a bill that will be discussed and debated in Parliament. What would be the big areas of negotiation? What would you require clarification from the government? I mean, a lot of states have expressed concerns on the timing of the compensation. Of course, the government is now guaranteed compensation for 5 years, but states want clarity on when the compensation will start to be rolled out, etc. What is it that you would now like clarifications on? What are the contentious issues that you will negotiate on?
See, passing is one. It may be passed today in Rajya Sabha. Amendments could be done in the Lok Sabha in winter session, but ultimately implementation is very important, and it has to happen from 1st April 2017. Then Government of India will have to take recourse to those actions, because more than 50% states will have to also agree to that, and then the President has assent, and as per the GST is concerned, it goes to the Council. The concerns of the state will be that just saying that they will compensate is not sufficient. It should be also legally made. Legally, it should come in the framework that Government of India will be bound to pay this compensation, which is very important.
But that's what they've said, sir. Now, I mean, the amendment that's been moved now, clause 19, which is the compensation clause, very categorically states that the centre shall pay for a period of 5 years.
That was the demand. That was the demand we made, and because I don't have the fine print of the bill which he has moved. But if it's there, it's good. But ultimately, we have to understand that states cannot lose their revenues, and for that, discussions will have to be done. All stakeholders have to be involved: the industry, trade, states, and then solutions have to be found amicably.
Yes, solutions will have to be found amicably. Mr. Goenka, let me come back to you now, sir. In terms of the positive impact as far as the GST rollout is concerned, and, the assumption is that we're still sticking with the April 1, 2017 timeline, though that has not been committed to by the Finance Minister or the government just yet. A, do you believe that that is a realistic timeline, April 1, 2017? And in terms of further clarifications from the government, what is it that industry would like to see going forward from an execution and an implementation standpoint?
Well, I think 1st April 2017 is a stretched timeline, but we have to work on it. The government, the industry, everybody else has to work on it to make April 1st, 2017 happen. I would also like to say that it's not something that we are starting on today. A lot of groundwork has happened, I think there's this GST and the network that has been set up. They've been doing work. And we have also been sort of trying to understand for quite some time and prepare ourselves, though we may not have started the actual execution. But in terms of what we need to do, we have a general idea of what we need to do. So starting point is not today. Starting point was a few months earlier. So I firmly believe that we should not doubt the ability of 1st April 2017 happening. If you start doubting, there'll be all kinds of sort of excuses that one can put up why it won't happen. But if you want to make it happen, it will happen. I have no concern about that. As far as what clarifications that we need, I think we just have to wait now a little bit longer. And as I said earlier, that none of us have sort of looked at fine print very seriously yet. The general view that there are certain things that we need to take care of, perhaps improve on, clarify, and we'll get into that. And from whatever I have seen so far, Government of India is very open to taking inputs from the industry at all levels, and we have given our inputs as SIAM, as CII, and those are being considered, and I'm sure immediately after this approval, the consultations will start, where we would again go in more seriously, look at the fine print and give our input. So there is nothing specific that I would like to talk about today. The only thing that I want to say, what I said earlier, is that we need to ensure that we don't make the whole thing too complicated. One of the biggest thing that we're looking forward to, in addition to India becoming one market and not having state boundaries, also is ease of compliance in terms of paperwork, documentation, so on and so forth. So I hope we just don't end up making it too complicated.
Yeah, that's right. Mr. Goenka, before I let you go, through the day we've had top voices on the channel, some calling this an historic day, some calling this reform the most awaited reform, the most transformational reform as well. What does today really mean as far as India's economic story is concerned?
I think it means a lot. Probably most of us don't realize even what it might do. in many ways. I mean, we talk about, and I'm talking manufactured goods. I do understand the service industry has some concern, so I'm talking about manufactured goods only. So first of all, what it might do to prices for consumers. I think most manufactured goods will become less expensive for consumers. Second, what it does for ease of doing business, which can get simplified tremendously. It's not just about paperwork. The fact that we don't have to look at tax consideration to decide where we set up our plant, where we do our warehouses, where we buy from, makes the business tremendously. It also makes Make in India more doable because suddenly the Indian goods, manufactured goods, become more competitive because at least 3 to 4%, in some cases 6 to 7% embedded taxes that we lose today will not be there anymore. So our manufactured output could become 5, 6, 7% more competitive for export, and that says a lot in terms of what it might do for Make in India. So I think it's as you said, it's the most awaited constitutional change. We have been waiting for almost 6, 7 years now. And something that I consider historical and could be redefining the Indian business industry economy in many ways.
Well,
and I was really looking forward to it, and yeah.
Yes, we all are. On that note, I'm going to thank you all for joining us. Rajeev, I'd request you to stay on, but Mr. Goenka and Mr. Deshpande, appreciate you joining us on CNBC TV 18 with your thoughts on what the GST will mean for the economy. Thanks very much indeed. Time for us to take a break, but our 360-degree coverage continues here on CNBC TV 18. We've been at it non-stop, and we will continue till the bill goes through. Stay right there. You're watching our continuing coverage on what is truly a historic day as we move towards the advent of the Goods and Services Tax. Today, the day when the Rajya Sabha is likely to clear the Constitutional Amendment Bill. Joining us now is Jan Den, the head of research at Ashmore Investment Management. Jan, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18. You know, from an FII perspective, how significant is this development?
It is hugely significant, in part because, especially for long-term institutional investors. And it's significant for two reasons. First of all, because long-term institutional investors like to see reforms, and this is probably one of the most profound reforms that India could do. India is a very, very inefficient economy because of its tax structure. And moving towards a more single market structure in India is very good for the long-term growth potential of India, and that's what institutional investors look for. The other reason why it's important is because there is a fascination with reforms in emerging markets and a somewhat unfair perception that emerging markets never do reforms. In fact, they do quite frequently. But nevertheless, when a country does reforms, it does leave a very positive impression about that country in comparison to other countries, and then it tends to draw in institutional money because it gets the image, the reputation for being a reformer. So it's important in its own right for India, but it's also important relative to other emerging market countries. And given how far Indian stocks have rallied, in a sense, India needs to deliver these reforms in order to validate current valuations.
Oh, you're absolutely right, Jan, and I agree with you that often, we get the stick for being seen as not reforming fast enough, or and this is a big reform. But you were talking about the valuation aspect, and at these valuations, because the rollout of the GST itself is still at least a year away. So from a short-term perspective, what does this really mean as far as inflows are concerned at these valuations?
I think you need to distinguish clearly between, among the foreign investors, between two types. There are the more short-term, momentum-oriented, hedge fundy, retail-y types of investors, and then there are the long-term institutional investors. And I think the more tactical of them, the former group, will definitely be aware of GST. They will already have positioned themselves accordingly. Long-term institutional investors that follow the credit closely will be aware of this as well, and and will be positioned for it. So in a sense, I think the tactical money, if you wish, is already in the trade, and so the risk here is that the GST bill is not passed. That would certainly lead to a souring of sentiment towards India, and you would definitely be able to see this in market valuations. On the other hand, if it does pass, which I certainly expect that it will, then what you're going to find is that institutional investors that have already put money in will be comfortable about putting in further allocations as part of sort of a gradual increase in their allocations to the credit. But you're not likely to see sort of a massive spike in inflows as a result. I think we've already seen that, and that's part of the reason why the stock market has done relatively well recently.
So given the story currently and given the possibility of the GST rollout, next year, Jan, what is it that you like at this point in time at current valuations, the sectors that could perhaps be most benefited with the advent of the GST?
Yeah, I think sectors that are likely to benefit immediately are sectors that are going to benefit particularly from sort of investment, because what this does is that it promises, as you say, next year, that there's going to be a more efficient economy and that we should expect the trend growth rate in India to be higher as a result of this. So that will tend to benefit the more longer term aspects. So we're talking here about construction. We're talking here about investment in equipment within companies. We are talking about, of course, there will be some more immediate benefits among transport and logistics companies, but there will also be some costs. These particular tax structures that exist at the moment have certainly benefited smaller, less efficient, state-specific companies, and many of those are going to struggle and will face more competition, and they will undoubtedly make some noise as a result of that. So probably more noise than the broader economy and the benefits that accrue to pretty much everyone else. So as always, when you have tax reforms, there are winners and losers, but in this case, the big winner is going to be the economy as a whole, and I think particularly the investment-sensitive sectors where big irreversible capital investments tend to be made. Those sectors are going to see more opportunity.
Jan, let me ask you, because you made that point about emerging markets and how this is needed, this reform is needed to validate the India story and the India valuations. How would India currently stack up on both those parameters in the emerging market basket?
On the fundamental basis, India stacks up extremely well. India has one of the highest growth rates in the world. Inflation's under control. On the reform side, it's doing very well, especially with the GST bill. There's also the market is also quite respectful, if you wish, of the efforts to reduce red tape and make India more efficient. It's not a 100% score, if you wish, on the scorecard, because there's certainly disappointment. At least I certainly have this disappointment that there's not been greater progress in opening the bond markets for foreign investors, but that is what it is. There's not enough political capital, it seems, to do both GST and to recapitalize the banking system fully in order to open the market for foreign investors. And in a choice between those two, I think the GST bill is ultimately more important for India. So in broad terms, the administration scores well on its reforms and its efforts to make India grow better, and the macroeconomic management of the economy and its growth rate is doing well. In terms of its attractiveness as a destination for foreign investors in the equity space, the big drawback is that the Indian equity market is more expensive than the EM average, and it's in fact also, and that means the majority of EM countries. And that's simply a recognition of the fact that the market has recognized and understood and appreciated the better macroeconomic fundamentals we've had in India under this administration. It's in the price. So in order for things to pick up from here, we're really looking at, we really need to see a more decisive upswing in consumer spending over the next couple of years, and I think that could drive earnings growth and therefore earnings significantly higher. And so I do think there is upside, but at current valuations, you have to be a little bit more selective in terms of where you take your exposure, rather than having as a beta play, as a broad play of Indian equities versus other equities in EM. I think there's more value in Latin America equity story, for example, than in the Indian one.
Jan, always a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us. Jan Den there of Ashmore, giving us a perspective on what FIIs make of the GST Constitutional Amendment Bill being passed and what that means as far as Indian equities are concerned. Let me very quickly bring in Rajeev Dimri back into this conversation. Rajeev, rates, etc. is going to be dealt with in the GST Bill. Let's just talk about the Constitutional Amendment Bill. We've seen the government move some crucial amendments now. The former Finance Minister accusing the government of some clumsy drafting, which I'm sure Finance Minister Arun Jaitley can throw right back at Mr. Chidambaram. I mean, we've seen what's happened with the companies law. But to your mind, today's amendments, what would be the highlight? Where do you believe that more work or more clarity is needed?
Well, there are several amendments that were made, some maybe because of drafting or tightening of the language that may replace with shall, to give better comfort to the states about the compensation, because this has been a matter of mistrust and distrust between the center and the states, that how real is this promise of compensation, will it be met on time, so on and so forth. The other aspect dealt with was this 1% movement of goods related tax from the origin state, which of course the whole corporate India had clearly rejected, but it was carried through in the Lok Sabha bill, and of course had to be amended for the Rajya Sabha. So from the overall architecture and overall GST aspect, these amendments are not changing any interpretation. Of course, these were relevant largely between the center and state to get the language which makes the states happy. But if you look at the corporate India, these amendments don't make any material difference in what they were viewing the GST to be.
All right, Rajeev, I'll come back to you, but Prashant is also standing by with our panel of experts in our Mumbai studio who've been watching closely the parliamentary debate with us. Prashant, over to you.
Thanks very much, Shireen. I mean, actually, just to take off from that point, one issue which we've been kind of discussing, this entire confusion about rates, states saying something, and the Congress, Mr. Chidambaram saying something, at the heart of it, maybe it is the inability to actually absolutely correctly estimate the potential revenues, right? Especially on account of services. States aren't being able to do that at this point in time. You were making that point earlier, Mr. Harishankar.
Yeah, so the fundamental fact is now states will get to levy so-called the SGST on services, and they have absolutely no clue as to what is that spread among the states. The largest states, some of the largest states have already started collecting that data to get a sense. But fundamentally, they don't have a sense. Somewhere that economic data does exist, because today there is a central service tax collection that happens, and it's one of the fastest growing pie of indirect tax among the central levies. So that's another reason why they are little not sure of what the rate should be, and they need to protect to the extent that you need to protect. And when you have the unknown, you tend to go for a higher rate. That's exactly what will happen. And but again, like I told you, politicians understand inflationary pressures. So the rates will have to be something which really doesn't impact the consumption, because indirect tax is a consumption across the population. It doesn't discriminate between the rich and the poor. And that's something they really do understand. So I think somewhere political maturity and sagacity, like it's prevailed today for passage of the Constitution Amendment Bill, will also prevail in the so-called GST Council.
Arun, you're smiling.
Mr. Harishankar has adopted Mr. Chidambaram's arguments, which he made literally. No, of course, I think the points that he's made is absolutely right. But look at the FAQs that have come from the Finance Ministry. The worry, the fear that has been expressed by a lot of companies, or India Inc. in general, is multiple registrations, maybe multiple returns, maybe multiple assessments, dispute resolution hanging. What if multiple states want to start? So look at the ease of procedure. Now the FAQ is saying existing VAT, central excise service tax payers will not have to apply afresh. Single application to be filed online. Maximum, most of the average taxpayers would be using only 4 forms for filing their returns. Small taxpayers who have opted for the composition scheme shall have to file return only on a quarterly basis. So they are hard selling now.
Arun,
the sort of
Sorry to interrupt you, but actually, you're doing a big service, because the Finance Ministry has been sending these FAQs. I don't think anyone has had the opportunity to really go over them. So I'm actually going to get our producers to check in with you and get those graphic plates out as well on the FAQs. But very quickly, Arun, for the benefit of our viewers, let's just go through some of those crucial clarifications that you were taking our viewers through.
Mainly, the FAQs, if you look at the first few 8 or 9 questions, they all deal with the points which you already know. What is GST? It says how does it work for business and industry, and they're saying easy compliance, uniformity of tax rates and structure, removal of cascading, improved competitiveness, gain to manufacturers and exporters. How will it be easy to administer for the central and state governments, better control on leakages, higher revenue efficiency for the consumer, single transparent tax proportionate to the value of goods and services. Then they are saying what we took our viewers through, the GST classroom, which are the states and central taxes that will be subsumed into the GST. What are the major chronological events that have led to the introduction of GST, something that the finance minister spoke earlier in the parliament today. How will the GST be administered in India? And there they talk about the federal structure, the CGST, the SGST. How would a particular transaction of goods and services be taxed simultaneously under CGST and state GST? They've in fact explained that with the help of a figure. I don't know whether the figure is not come here, but these are the FAQs that have come out today, from the Ministry of Finance, and they say that the central GST and state GST would be levied simultaneously on every transaction of supply of goods and services, except on exempted goods and services. Question 7: will cross utilization of credits between goods and services be allowed? Absolutely, they will be allowed. That's the FAQ. How will IGST, the interstate transaction of goods and services, be taxed under GST in terms of the IGST method? It says that the center would levy and collect the IGST on all interstate supplies. The IGST would be roughly equal to CGST plus SGST. So these are the FAQs. The most important part, takeaway from this is they are trying to show this is going to be, they are not going to unleash the bureaucracy, Raj. It will be a tax which will be easy to administer, which will be customer or taxpayer friendly. That's basically to calm the nerves of India.
Let's ask our tax experts if they feel calmed at the end of the FAQs that you've just spelled out. Hari, let me start by asking you.
Yeah, Shireen, these FAQs are obviously trying to educate people on what the whole structure is. But I think to a large extent, corporate India is already aware of what the FAQs has been. We've seen the business process documents, we've seen the model law, we all know how the credit mechanism works. These are all something which conceptually I don't think corporates are not aware. They're aware. It's the lower down the chain, the entire ecosystem of the corporates which needs to be aware of. And that's where the real pain will be, because that's where the awareness has to go through. So this is something which is fine. What still remains to be seen is what is the devil in the fine print. That's what remains to be seen. The stakeholder consultations have started as far as the model law is concerned. All industry chambers have started sending back their comments. There are a few issues that needs to be tweaked in the law. So that's where the whole exercise will begin now, because these FAQs, I don't know, the FAQs have not really clarified more than what people know. Yes, some of the people may not know, but most of the people know it.
Fair point. So you're saying that most is already known. It's merely a reiteration, at least for those who already know. But let me start by asking.
Yeah, reiteration is the right word. Reiteration is the right word.
Sure. So let me start by asking each one of you, and then I'll start with Rajeev here, and then toss it across to the panel in Bombay. But Rajeev, we're starting a campaign here on CNBC TV 18 on the model law and the pain points that the model law needs to address before we actually move forward. Let me start by asking you about some of the crucial pain points that you would like addressed.
Well, there are a number of issues with the model draft law, which I'm sure, would always be in any exercise of this nature. But the ones that I'm looking at, one is that there was stated objectives of GST, unification of India market, expansion of credit, broadening of the tax base is fine. But what about improving the adversarial tax environment, reducing litigation? So those are the things that are not coming out of the draft law, because the powers that are proposed in the law of the central and state agencies are immense. if this is meant to be a self-policing environment, then why do we need so many powers? What about the statute of limitations which are not there? So there are many aspects that have been seen as areas that needed to be improved in our existing law. We don't see that being improved. So that's one, area of work. When we talk of simplification of compliances, certainly, as we heard the manufacturing sector, that 17 indirect taxes will come down. Sure, and I go back and repeat the point that today an average service company, a small company like ours, we have to file 2 service tax returns on an all-India basis. We might have to go to over 100 returns across 4 states. Now, so one segment of the industry or commerce will see reduction of compliances, but another segment may see a lot more that needs to be done. So service companies having to deal with states is a big deal. Think of large companies, State Bank of India, present in every state in the country. Their compliance points will increase dramatically as compared to what they do today. So there is a mixed bag for some of those, and that is bound to happen. It's nothing new. It's not a surprise. If you stick to the draft law, we've had series of Tax Administrative Reform Commission reports, taxpayer rights, taxpayer services. None of those concepts find its way into the draft law.
Okay. Mr. Prem Narayan, do you want to add to the list that Rajeev has just spelled out?
I'd like to look at it in a different perspective, if I may. And I got to make 2 or 3 points. To me, the sentiment globally for India will go up because of this GST. That is the most important thing. And as somebody else mentioned earlier, what's also critical is that you take REITs, for instance. The government in 2014 in July, they came out with REITs, and it had hassles about pass-through and stamp duty. But that was sorted out, and today it is so well positioned that I believe very comfortably in the next 3 years at least $30 billion will come in only in the property sector. Then that has happened because over a period of time. Likewise in GST, it will get sorted out, and today if we start looking at all the scarecrows in that, I think it's going to be wrong. So it's a very positive step. I also believe that I don't want to argue with Mr. Rao whether it's 18% or 17.5% in UK, etc. The prime point is that with 18%, compared to what it is about 28% today, between 25 and 30, what it's going to do is that I'm going to become, as a small-scale industry or a medium-scale industry, extremely competitive globally. That is one. Point number 2, it's going to enhance tax collection. So let's bat on the front foot, and let's see that we can hit how many sixes and win as a nation.
Okay.
You're absolutely right on that. Arun, you want to check in with everyone else?
Absolutely. Rohit, I think one point is quite critical on the administrative side and the industry preparedness. Generally, if we have to implement GST on April 1, how ready is the industry A? And then after that, I'll come to Harishankar. Harishankar, you mentioned Malaysia. Take us through a few countries that have implemented GST in the last 5 years. It's not been an easy ride for some of them. I have met the Malaysian inspector, the IRS officer who was in charge of GST implementation. The first 12 months were a nightmare. Rohit, you go first.
Just to add what Shireen was asking first, that what are the 2 things that industry is really looking at post this event? One most important thing is the uniformity. We are going to have a dual GST, what it means that we will have central law and 30 state laws. Yeah. We had experience of VAT. In 2005, when we got the VAT in India, it was all uniform. Today, when we sit in 2016, most of the provisions are not uniform. Be it rate of tax, be it compliance, be it the credit-related aspects. We don't want that we will again go through the same position under GST. What we expect is that GST Council will play a far better role. While it is a recommendatory body, but it should play a very significant role in getting a uniformity to the industry. And the second aspect, which is most critical, is in terms of the clarity and a certainty on some of the key aspects of it. Let me give you only one example. Today we don't have a concept of interstate supply of service. We have only one law, which is union law. There is no concept of interstate or intrastate. We had a concept of interstate sale of goods in 1956. After 80 years of being enacted, we are still today disputing on that concept. What industry doesn't want, that we have certain critical aspects of interstate intrastate, IGST, CGST, SGST, complete clarity on a certainty on those issues, so that you don't have to go
you
through
don't
again.
want to go after 15 years to the Supreme Court
Again, and we next 50 years we litigate on those issues. That's a two aspect I believe is a critical one. And last one, in terms of your industry preparedness, I believe many of the industries are waiting and watching for this event today. While some of the industry players have started doing the homework, getting prepared for transition to GST, but many of them are waiting for this event to occur. And because this event was happening, and it's finally going to happen
so
today.
Near yet so far. Finally, we have traveled the distance between the cup and the lip.
I believe industry will need to have a longer time. Last point, that success of GST, I would believe, is a pill with GST pill this industry is getting. And if I want to expand that pill, P is clearly a political, the process how it is going through is infrastructure, what we'll get for the industry, L being most importantly the legislation what we get, and lastly lead time for the industry. And that will decide whether this pill is a good or bad for the industry.
Hari?
No, so
foreign experience.
Yeah, so before I even come to the Malaysia experience, and Malaysia is the experience I generally tend to quote because that's the most recent, latest example of a country unveiling GST in 2015. First and foremost, Malaysian experience, the Malaysian law was known more than a year before. Single GST. Much simpler in structure because they don't have a federal structure, so don't have to go through this combination of concurrent CGST and SGST. And the pain was immense. Pain was immense in large corporates, in smaller traders. There are several professionals in India who have come from Malaysia in the last 1 year, and nobody has not told me that it was so painful in Malaysia. I cannot even imagine what's going to be in India. Let me tell people, and I tell this people very, very, I would say quite passionately, GST is definitely a tax reform. But let me tell you, it will impact every aspect of business.
It will be painful.
It will impact processes, controls, IT, change management, pricing, margins, working capital, reporting. So it's not what people think it is. So it will require a fair amount of time. Another thing is that even in large corporates, most of the ERPs are on versions which will not even be capable of accepting simple GST patches that the so-called ERP service providers will provide.
Ari, I'm going to request Shireen to ask this question to a lot of CEOs who will comment after the bill gets passed. But the general feeling is a lot of CEOs of India Inc. Are not aware of some of the pain points that you're talking of. They see it as a landmark tax reform which is going to change the way businesses work, but they're not aware of these pain points.
I would not say they're not aware, because I have seen several people who are aware of what the issue is. The question is, the problem that the industry has is that this is such a large reform and requires such degree of senior bandwidth for execution of this so-called program. Is they really wanting to wonder whether they want to disrupt their existing business and concentrate on this, because you're still running a dynamic business, and then you have to also handle this law and the transition of this law. So that's where the whole problem is. So many have understood, many have done some degree of preparation, some are in advanced stage, many are not. But the pain is not the corporate, but the entire ecosystem of the corporates, their vendors, their distributors, the service providers. Like Rajeev rightly said, for services this is going to be a huge change. Financial services, telecom, companies like us who dealt with only one authority, which is the central service tax authorities. Now you probably potentially will have to register wherever your offices are or your businesses are. So what happens to the entire services industry, and hence what happens to the IT systems for handling some of those changes?
Mr. Deepak is now looking a little
very
worried.
Valid point.
No, not at all.
Very valid point, Hari, you're making. But whenever there's complication when it comes to tax, Arun, guess who's going to be smiling all the way to the bank? It's going to be these gentlemen who are sitting here with us in the studio.
And we will be kept busy. Shireen, we are going to be kept busy.
Plus digital technology,
yes, we're going to be kept busy. We're going to take a quick break, but when we return, we will talk about some of those crucial issues that our panel was raising here, the implications and the impact, especially for the services sector. We will discuss that and much more when we return, and we'll of course be joined by many more guests, so stay right there. Our continuing coverage will return. The government tables the Goods and Services Tax Bill in the Rajya Sabha for debate, circulates list of 9 amendments, yields to the Congress demand of scrapping a contentious 1% levy on the interstate supply of goods.
This was in fact pooling in of sovereignty of the states and the center so that we could have a system which was a far better and a more modern, conducive system, and eventually give a boost to the Indian economy itself.
Finance Minister Arun Jaitley expresses confidence in the passage of the bill, says inter-party discussions have made the bill stronger, assures that alcohol will be kept out of the GST ambit.
In the name of the people, I ask you to keep this rate at the rate recommended by your CAA, namely the standard rate should not exceed 18.
The standard GST rate should not exceed 18%, says P. Chidambaram, warns of a serious backlash from the people if it's higher, asks the government to accept the recommendations of its own chief economic advisor.
GST could also be interpreted as Girgit Samjhota tax.
The proposal by the central government is unfair, arbitrary, unconstitutional, illegal.
Political parties present their reactions to the bill in Parliament. Across the line, they do call for the fact that the bill should not come in as a money bill in the next session.
I don't think anybody formally accepted economic advisors' figures. Everyone who spoke demanded a higher rate.
Kerala's Finance Minister Thomas Isaac tells CNBC TV 18 in an exclusive interview that most states have rejected the Arvind Subramanian panel's recommendation of an 18% standard rate of GST, says it has to be more. Well, we've got a exclusive panel joining us here on CNBC TV 18. We've been, of course, tracking the action right through from 7 o'clock in the morning. Joining us now is the spokesperson for the AIADMK, Mr. K. Pandiyarajan. Mr. Pandiyarajan, thanks very much for joining us. The AIADMK has moved several amendments in the Rajya Sabha today, sir, but your party MP also very categorically stated that you believe that this bill is not constitutionally valid. Are we given to understand that you will vote against the bill?
Yeah. Yeah, sure, as it is, because as you know, even the bill does not represent whatever we were told has been passed in the cabinet, especially this 5 years norm, which they said will have a constitutional commitment, or that they will pay up to 5 years. But now they're saying in this bill, as it got moved, they're saying that the parliament has the authority to reduce this. We don't understand what was the logic behind this. Neither has there been a clarity on the principles by which the compensation gets worked out, nor has there been any listening to what the states unanimously wanted, which is a higher voting percentage representation for the larger states. We wanted it in proportion to the Rajya Sabha representation for each of the states. None of that has been heeded, and it's been just moved because BJP and Congress seem to be, in many senses, completely against fiscal autonomy for the states. We did move quite some distance. AIADMK, as you know, first raised these 10 issues initially when Congress passed this earlier in the parliament, and since then we've been talking about it. 7 issues have been addressed, redressed, but the 3 key issues have just not been addressed at all. And in fact, one of the issues where we thought there is certain agreement, the central government seems to have gone back, in a way saying that Parliament has the authority to reverse this 5-year compensation. What message they are trying to give, we really don't know. So that's why our representative in the Rajya Sabha spoke about it as unconstitutional, illegal, and actually immoral, because they've actually gone back on their stances.
So, Mr. Pandiyarajan, you're calling this unconstitutional, illegal and immoral. What does that mean, sir, when it comes for the time for the vote? Will you abstain? Will you vote against it if your amendments are not accepted?
As our representative, the head of our Rajya Sabha team, Mr. Navneetha Krishnan, expressed that
eloquently in the parliament. I think it's important that central government sees the reality and not assume that they can bulldoze through the Rajya Sabha just because Congress is in agreement with what they say, because none of the three things, and actually the fourth element, which is the 5-year commitment, which they gave hardly 2 days back, now they're going back on it. So obviously those three terms which are representative and Rajya Sabha used are really the way to describe this bill. In my view, it's going to be extremely negative, especially given the sense of the House where Mr. Chidambaram initiated the discussion talking about how it can't be more than 18%. His entire argument was based on the consumers and on the industry. Here are state governments which are origin states, exporting states, which will stand to lose one hell of a lot. You have to have India moving together as a whole. You can't have India progress